a lot of people in the waiting room, and people will be joining us, but we do have a wonderful panel. We have, this is a topic I'm sure all of us will have a lot to talk about and discuss. So let's get started. So welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good night, greetings for whatever time of the day it is in your part of the world. The beauty of these global Zoom calls is that we experience all the time zones and all the countries together at one time and in one place. Thank you for joining us, despite it being late for some of you, very late for some of you, and very early for some of you. We appreciate your commitment to community-led development and to the movement, and you're constantly being with us in this journey. I'm Gunjan Veda, Senior Advisor with the Movement for Community-Led Development, and I will be facilitating today's call with John Coonrod, who is the co-founder of the movement and also the Executive Vice President of the Hunger Project. So Zoom has become the new way of life. All of us kind of know what to do on Zoom calls. We're not going to spend a lot of time on logistics, but you would have seen that we are recording this call. We want to make sure that the discussion is available for everyone, and this will be put up on the MCLD website afterwards. We really value your voice, but we want to cut out the noise. So please keep yourself muted during this call, unless we specifically call on somebody to speak. Otherwise, with so many people on the call, we'll have a lot of chaos going around. But please use the chat box. We want to hear from you. We want to know what you think. The panelists would love to get your questions, your experiences of it. So we absolutely want to hear from you. Use the chat box, and we can start using it now actually to introduce ourselves, because it's always nice to know who we are sharing brain space with in the room, right? And who we are co-thinking and co-creating with. So please use the chat box to introduce yourself. My colleague Anna Slattery is going to be monitoring the chat box, and she will be curating questions as we go through the panel discussion. So we are listening to you, we are monitoring what, we are listening, and we'll be curating everything that you'll be saying. Use the chat box. With that, if we can go to the next slide, please, John. Thank you. So our agenda today is straightforward, really. In the movement for community-led development, and I'm sure a lot of you, we've always known that communities are the first responders in any crisis or in any situation. But the pandemic has really brought that issue front and center for the world, and we've seen that growing recognition. But communities, even without the resources, we saw during the pandemic how they mobilized to keep themselves and those around them and their neighbors and others safe and fed. And how they handled and tackled all the challenges that the pandemic threw their way. Imagine what would happen if those communities actually had the resources to be able to carry on the work that they want to do. So why are we here today? We're here today really to discuss the challenges and emerging opportunities for ensuring that local communities are able to mobilize the resources that they need in order to build back better post-COVID-19. Because all of us know that our world before COVID-19 really was full of challenges and problems. We dealt with patriarchy, we lived in an inequitable society, there was malnutrition, there was food insecurity, all of those problems. We don't want to go back to that world. We want to build back better, and communities are the way forward to that. But how can we strengthen this ecosystem of funding so that communities can do this, right? So we're going to start with a quick introduction to the movement and the topic, and then we're going to dive right into the panel discussion. We have a wonderful lineup of panelists representing different agencies and different parts of this ecosystem of funding that we need for communities. So we're going to go into that. We will be, please put in your questions and comments, as I said, in the chat box as we go through the panel discussion. We'll keep curating them and bringing them into the discussion. And then we are going to end the day with a call to action. So that what is the way forward for all of us? With that, if we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a very quick and brief introduction to the movement. The Movement for Community-Led Development was launched the same day that the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the UN General Assembly. So this was a group of organizations who got together and said, well, this is great that we have the SDGs, but remember the MDGs? And remember what happened out there? If we really are serious about attaining our Sustainable Development Goals, we have to change the way we think about development and the way we do development. We have to put communities front and center. And what started out then as the small group is today a consortium of over 1,500 local civil society organizations and 70 INGOs from around the world. And many of us here see each other on the calls regularly. We meet regularly, we discuss, we share, we co-create, we collaborate, we learn from each other, and we learn with each other in the movement. The Hunger Project is the global secretariat for the movement. The real heart and soul of our movement are our national chapters. And these are really organic groups of local organizations and even the country offices of INGOs that come together towards this common cause of putting communities front and center in development. We also have a number of working groups that work on specific issues from evaluation and research to, strengthening the practice of CLD or, looking at the humanitarian development and peace nexus. Next slide, please. Sorry, the one before, John. So in the movement, we have 5 goals that we have identified for ourselves: ensuring voice and agency for women, youth, and marginalized groups, adequate community finance, which is what we are all here discussing today. And from the movement, we believe that at least 20% of the funds have to be devolved to the community level for real community action to take place. Good local governance, quality public services, and resilience. How do we do this? How do we achieve these goals? If we go to the next slide, please. Like I said, the heart and soul of our movement are our national chapters. And our national chapters and the organizations in there have 2 kinds of partnerships within countries. So they have advocacy partnerships where they really try to mobilize public policy and policymakers around devolution, around the need for devolving funding and decision-making to the local levels. And we have facilitation partnerships where we support communities, where we support CBOs, really to be able to take action towards the goals that they set for themselves. And when these 2 things happen together, we believe that we will be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And all of us in the Global Secretariat of the movement are really there to support the national chapters and these organizations in whatever capacity they need and whatever they ask us for. So that's what the movement is, and that's where we are all, that's how all of us got together. And with that, I am going to hand it over to John to really get us started about why we are here today, the ecosystem of funding.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gunjan. And I'm going to start by just introducing who is going to be on the panel, and then I'll be able to take the slides down. So we have a panel that really does represent this, this ecosystem of community finance, although there are many. We could have had a panel of 12 because there's lots of different and challenging pools of funding for communities to access in the world. So Amita Gill has been a champion for good local governance, and I've gotten to work with her for quite a few years at the United Nations Development Program. Zipporah Wambua, who goes by Zippy, she works in one of Makueni County, and Makueni County in Kenya. Kenya is, I think, the only country in sub-Saharan Africa that has devolved 20% of resources to its counties. Their motto is one country, 49 governments. And she will be speaking. Jamie Boakes is, as you can see, heads a local public sector alliance, so that actual people who make local government work are in an alliance that Jamie directs. Jenny Hodgson is director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. Jenny was the first person who ever heard use the hashtag Shift the Power. And she not only focuses on community foundations, but again, really looking at how the larger Shift the Power movements can be effective in the world. And then Arjun Tasker is here from USAID, the new partnership initiative. And as many of you have seen, USAID has recently made a very strong public commitment to a vision of community-led development. So, but before we go to the panel, I'm going to introduce someone else. For, a 1.5-minute video clip from a rural community in the central region of Ghana. Now, the Hunger Project, through individual and family financial contributions, has supported clusters of villages in mobilizing themselves and building both the physical and social infrastructure to take charge of their own development. That doesn't mean they never need partnership from anyone, but they are able to then get it themselves. So this is a short story of a rural community that has done that. Let me share the screen and share system audio. Share.
The tidal epicenter building lacked a toilet facility, and this affected the chips compound that we have here at the epicenter. So the leadership of the epicenter, together with the chief, saw the need to go out to seek for help.
US Embassy, Hobwa, Nti Yachro Krata, Nayado call. This is a summary. Now, this is a summary is woman here Krata, Nayada County at the quarter, US Embassy. Now, also, Waji, another Southern Tum, now one man here, Nti in one bar, now, community Nina, I can hear Hobo, Nay, Narayazina, or the Dam.
Now I can boldly say that persons who come here, or community partners who come here to visit the chief's compound, feel so comfortable.
So any of us who have ever written a grant proposal have got to be standing in awe and admiration of the chiefs and the locally elected community leaders in Taidu. But that is such a rare occurrence, and we need to work together to make sure that shift the power really does mean shift the money. And that's what today is about. So I would like to start the panel discussion with the same question to each panelist, which is, how does the area where you focus on finance fit into the ecosystem? What are its unique contributions? And I wanted to start with Jenny, because not enough people know about what community foundations are doing around the world. Jenny?
Thanks very much, John, and greetings everybody from Johannesburg. Yeah, the Global Fund for Community Foundations for the last 16 years has been looking at something that's as old as the world and is also quite new and unknown in the context of international development, which is problematic from the start. The old as the world bit is that people have always helped each other. They've always created systems of mutuality, solidarity, self-help, and this has been a fabric of many societies, often because of the failure of the state. I mean, let's face it, but actually also, weddings, funerals, school fees, all these kinds of things have really mattered in many parts of the world. And I think what happened in 2020 and 2021 is actually some of that, the recollection of why that stuff really mattered also became clear in the global north too. What mattered when COVID hit was community resources, mutual aid groups, actually the idea that those around you are really the heart and center of community development work. So our journey has really kind of accompanied two tracks. One has been this idea that systems of giving and solidarity have always existed, but they've always been invisible and overlooked by the dominant system. The dominant system is preoccupied with its own money and how it's dispersed and accounted for. And if you think, if you like, you're watering a garden, maybe blasting water over the soil and in the process not seeing and even destroying the green shoots that are there. I think there's been a lot of writing and research on how these systems of solidarity and mutuality work, and an understanding that they're based on trust and social capital and all the things that we know matter in development work. I think the last few years have also seen growing middle classes around the world and the emergence of new, extremely wealthy members of societies all around the world. We know inequality within countries is greater than it is even between countries these days. So the other thread of this work is the fact that the current development paradigm cannot continue as it is. It was, cooked up after the Second World War and very much framed in a world that is not today's world. And I think, again, COVID really kind of threw everything up in the air. So we know the dominant system needs to rethink its role and purpose. And community philanthropy is really trying to take that impulse of communities to work together, to help each other, and to sort of bring it up into the modern age, to say, actually, we do have the roots of our own self-resourcing systems, whether that's of movements or of civil society. And so our work has really focused on really narrowing down kind of effective development to three things. One is around assets, the creation and mobilization of long-term assets, including local resources. That changes the power dynamic when people themselves give, whether it's communities contributing or the middle classes giving an expression of their citizenship and participation, or the wealthy giving in collective ways. And I think a lot of the emergence of community philanthropy has been really focused on that, not just the money, but actually how do you move the position of people in the development system so they're not beneficiaries, but they are co-investors. Yes. So we've built up a network of around 200 partners in 200 partners in 70 countries around the world. And they tend to be community proximate or community-based organizations, mostly grant makers themselves, that are talking about and encouraging the development of local resources as a central tenet of community-owned development and shifting power.
Fabulous, Jenny, thank you. So from that community mutuality perspective, we'll step up to the level of county government. And I'd like to call on Zipporah, who goes by Zippy. Zippy, if you could turn on your mic and camera, we'd love to see you and just hear about how this devolved finance is working in Kenya, what it has made possible that wasn't possible before.
Thank you very much, and good morning on that side of the world, and good afternoon here in Kenya. My name is Zipporah Wambua. I prefer Zippy, as John has said. I'm excited to be in this panel. I'm excited to state that the actualization of the Kenyan Constitution here in Kenya is made possible through the establishment of the people structures, and two, the articulation of the principles of devolution that talks about devolving power, and devolving power really meaning devolving finances to the people. At the national level, at least 20% of the national finances are devolved to the 47 counties, whereas here in Makueni, within that percentage, therefore, is 18% devolved further to the wards. And from the wards, therefore, is at least 6% since 2019, when we became signatories of the movement for community-led development in Nairobi, and therefore launched the Makueni chapter of the same. This has been actualized through community action planning that leads to micro projects and micro project proposals that are done by villages and villagers to meet their own needs. Over the time, we can testify the unique advantage that we have been able to see, at least to some extent, the implementation of universal water access, which wouldn't have been done while monies were still at the national level or at the county level, nor even at the ward level, as I'm talking about. The question of the universal health care that has to do with contributions of communities towards a common health care scheme that enables them to gain health services throughout the year for a period of a year and renewable in the following financial year. There has been great realization of community philanthropy. And just as my colleague has said, this is a reality that where communities are able to think together, we can see the demonstrations between the rich and the poor being able to generate indigenous knowledge while there is support from the middle class and so forth. There is also the realization.
Oops. I think Zippy has lost her connection. Sarah, if you could WhatsApp or chat to Zippy to join, and we'll let her back in when she's able to reconnect. But it has been remarkable, and in fact, it was people at USAID who first told me of the rapid reduction of poverty that began happening across Kenya when it devolved resources to the counties. I'm going to pose the same question now. So Jamie has this network of Zippies around the world, and I want to hear how that network has benefited the communities in being able to utilize and access funding.
Sure. Thanks so much, John, for inviting me to this very exciting forum. Indeed, the Local Public Sector Alliance is a global alliance for champions of inclusive and efficient decentralization and development. It takes a little bit of a different angle than the movement does, in that there are many people at different levels of government who are interested in achieving inclusive and efficient development. But I think over time, the way policy practitioners have divided themselves up haven't necessarily connected and achieved inclusive multi-level governance systems. And so what the Local Public Sector Alliance tries to do is to bring together people at all levels of government, including the community level, to make the public sector work in an inclusive manner. So, you know, Jenny mentioned dominant systems. Within those dominant systems, there are allies. And what we are trying to do is to bring together allies from central government across different ministries, allies from local government and from the community and from service providers, in order to see if we can get to a more inclusive, decentralized system. Now, the folks like myself who come out of the decentralization community of practice, we used to not look very much at community issues, and we used to not look very much at service delivery issues because we're political scientists and economists and other people, and we like to think abstractly. And we kind of forgot about all these important things about inclusion and about community engagement until fairly recently. So the Local Public Sector Alliance is trying to shift that core of the community of practice towards understanding sustainability, inclusion, and resilience in terms of making sure that that development is people-focused or community-led. And indeed, within that context, I think there are very important things we're uncovering. And Gunjan mentioned it's important to have finance. And we found that many countries' intergovernmental fiscal systems don't lend themselves very well to inclusion at the local level. A lot of countries have conditional grant systems whereby resources are pushed down below, but they're not discretionary. So communities aren't engaged in their prioritization and spending. In other countries, the grant system might be too unconditional and politicians get their hands on them, whether members of parliament or elected local leaders who make politically based decisions and are not held accountable for results or other things. So decentralization is this messy system. It is complex. It is different in different countries. And as a global community of practice coming from the public sector management, decentralization, public financial management communities of practice, we don't understand that very well. And we're helping to try to shape the terminology and the playing field so that different parts of that global community of practice can understand each other. So in that regard, obviously there's the role of local development funds, which I think have done a lot in terms of getting communities engaged. Even during the age of COVID, a number of countries have provided grants to state and local governments to allow the community to shape the responses to COVID. In other parts of the community of practice where UNCDF is actively promoting something called LOCAL, which is climate action funding that can be managed at the community level and where the community gets engaged in funding their priorities. So there are a number of ways to do this. Globally, one of the big challenges we're facing is that we don't have the metrics to measure what we treasure, so that we don't actually know really well how much money is going down. We know it in Kenya because they route it through the county government. But for instance, in Mozambique, until recently, Mozambique was not a country that had local governments outside the urban areas. So the truth is, unless we make a very focused effort, it's very hard to compare across countries how localized we are. And that is something that as an alliance, we're trying to bring the metrics and the methodology to start measuring that.
Wonderful. So Arjun, I'd like to call on you. Now you represent, I guess, the world's biggest funder in this field. So, and have just made this, your administrator has just made this big commitment. I'd love to hear really what you see is the role of bilaterals in community-led development.
Thanks, John. Yeah, well, I will first say up front, I don't represent USAID. I'm not allowed to do that, but I am happy to be here. I'm grateful to be invited to provide whatever insights I can and what I see from my perch at the New Partnerships Initiative, where I do also sit on the localization working group and work on these issues, including, and thank you to the movement for facilitating a conversation on local capacity development policy, which is definitely something we hope to ground in sort of community-led development. I think there's a few distinct challenges for bilateral donors here. One is the measurement issue. We often cannot tell where the money is going once you get past sort of our prime partner, whether that's a local prime or it is an huge international prime partner. We don't have systems for knowing what happens in the activity beyond that unless, it gets submitted in a quarterly report, right? We actually only have systems for tracking the use of funds so we can do audits and be responsive to Congress. And that makes things very difficult, especially as we look at the administrator's call to action around inclusive development and desire for us to pivot, not just to in a sense of making more awards to and with local organizations, but to elevate sort of community voice and ensure that local voice is not just at the table, but influencing the activities that are initiated when USAID spends money, right? And how exactly can USAID do that? And how can we tell whether it's happening or not? Is this like huge question? So that's one piece. Another piece is, we aren't built to, we have two big constraints to do things like provide core funding or work at a grassroots level. And one of those constraints is that type of work, especially for the agency and its processes, takes more time. And we get, 8 months to spend our money. As soon as when there's a CR, the amount of time, continuing resolution, the amount of time when money comes to USAID and has to go out the door just shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And we're operating at such a huge scale. It's so much money that having such limited time is just crazy. And then the other big piece is it's a highly earmarked money, right? Congress told us we have to spend this much money in this country on water and this much money. So how exactly are we able to be responsive to community priorities when you have that constraint? Now there are ways, and USAID is super diverse and heterogeneous, and we are not consistent from country to country or even office to office in a single country. And that means we have some amazing examples of the agency being able to support community-led development, and some examples where our attempt to do so harmed communities, right? Mm. And so that's part of the struggle. And I'm excited to be here for this conversation so I can steal from the thinking of the members of the community here and from everyone else on the panels. I'm already planning to steal a bunch of Jenny's work and just sort of inject it into localization stuff. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to talking.
That's great, Arjun. So now all the way up to the international system, Amita Gill has been heading this work ever since we launched the movement, and I've had the privilege of being in villages in Uganda and Bolivia with Amy, and so I'd like to hear what do you see as the role, kind of unique role of UNDP in this ecosystem?
Thanks, John, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's a really interesting topic, and of course, the most important topic that we ever talk about is financing and what that actually means. And I do feel a bit fraudulent being in a room with so many experts who actually know and are working on the ground of community-led development, and then you're asking me to come up with solutions, because honestly, I wish I had a solution. I wish I had a solution for the annual financing gap of 2.5 trillion that we have to achieve the SDGs. And it's just, when we're looking at that amount of money, it's a crazy figure. So UNDP, what we do is that we try, first of all, to learn from other people and to share those experiences. We're very lucky in the sense that we're a multilateral organization across loads of countries, so we can share experiences and be the organization that sort of brings those different ideas together. And we're trying to do that a lot more within a system that, as Jenny pointed out, was set up after the Second World War in a very different situation. So it's trying to move a bureaucracy and a system within the system. We do a lot of work that Jamie mentioned. I've been working with Jamie for years, where we're looking very much at how finance flows, and it mentioned too, how finance flows from the central to local levels. I mean, local governments are dependent, it's between 70 to 80 generally % of their income is intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And so there's a lot of things that aren't very interesting, except to a small group of us that really enjoy talking about financial matters and how the money flows and what that means on transparency. But it's important that that is transparent and that people know how much is coming and that is delivered in a timely manner, because it is for services. So there's the sort of governmental side, and with that there comes taxation reforms, different ways of looking at taxation, and to see it not as a predatory system, but a way of actually ensuring that resources are shared. There's a lot of work that's being done right now by United Cities Local Government, UCLG, which is the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Government, where they're looking at something called the caring city, which is a phrase that I really enjoy. After we've had strong, stable, smart and everything else, I actually think this idea of a caring city and one that looks at social services in a different way is interesting and something that we should look at, certainly within sort of community-led processes. Just to touch on the other side, we're not just working on the governmental side, we're also trying to work with private sector to sort of push them in a different way of actually funding. We have different projects that look at this globally. One I just wanted to talk very briefly about is something that we do in the Maldives that's called Make My Island. The Maldives is a particularly unique situation where you have a lot of very large business interests and a population that do not see most of that finance that flows because of their natural resources. So we're trying to set up a platform that bring those two groups together more and actually allow for the money to flow in a way with some level of risk management. And I think that's something that Arjun touched on very briefly. And I just want to mention it now, though I can elaborate later. There's so much in the current system that is about risk. There is so much about how we can't do something because this might happen. And yet, if we really want to foster change, we have to look at doing things differently. And if you do things differently, you have to be able to fail. And that's something as an organization in UNDP, we are still trying to get to grips with. We have a tendency of telling you our great successes around the world and how amazing we are. But we need to be able to say, well, this didn't work. And we are trying to do with now small amounts of funding where we have agreements with funders that we can experiment, that we can do things differently. We've set up something called the Accelerator Lab Network that now sits in, I think it's 72 different countries. With small amounts of funding, we're trying to look at new ways of doing things and new ways, which includes financing, new ways of looking at financing. Bonds aren't new, but they are a different way of looking at local government finance in some places, because we then work with UNCDF, which is our capital development fund, on looking at the guarantee for that. Or something like risk insurance financing around disaster risk reduction, and bringing groups of countries together so you share the risk. These sort of different ways of trying to work within a system and sort of push it as much as it's possible. I will stop there for now, but thank you, John.
Thanks, Amy. I'm looking forward to you and hosting a Fail Fest soon so that we can share these failures. And so thank you all for this first round. Gunjan, I think I'm going to call an audible here and maybe come back to you, and you could go back to the field here for a moment and to West Africa. So Gunjan.
Thank you so much, John. So we've heard from different players of the funding ecosystem, but the one group that we have yet to hear from is actually the community-based organizations and the local organizations who are working. And so we're going to hear from Sierra Leone. Lansana Conde is going to share with us a little bit about what this funding ecosystem is looking like for them and some of the challenges that they face. So Lansana, over to you, if you can unmute and share with us. And I'll also ask everyone to bear with us because Lansana is calling from the village and there may be connectivity issues, but we really want to make sure that we can hear from him. So Lansana, over to you.
You're muted, Lansana. Could you unmute?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Lansana Conde, the program
Wonderful.
lead of. Hello.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hello.
Go
Yes,
ahead. We
I'm
can hear
Lansana Conde, the
you.
program lead of Mazofia Agric Farmers Organization and a member of the Sierra Leone Movement chapter. MAFO as an organization is a rural community in the north of Sierra Leone, working with women in agricultural sectors and among others. We link the cooperative women into the market. During the pandemic, we were able to communicate to the local authorities, especially at the peak of the pandemic when the country was closed for lockdown. So there were no movement for us to go to this community. What we did, we created a platform, and with some our local authorities, we create for them a WhatsApp group so to continue to sensitize them about the danger of the pandemic. Our challenges at the moment, funding, we don't have funding. Our funding we normally have is our contribution. Our membership contribution is what we have at the moment. But we are very grateful for the global movement of community-led development. And we have a chapter with colleagues, organizations. We have of the Sierra Leone Movement chapter now, which is officially functioning. Of course, my colleagues are in this forum as I speak. Our challenges we face with lack of mobility, technical support, and financial resources. We believe as a movement, we have been part of the movement, we share ideas, we also share common resources among the chapters, and we are very grateful for the support we get from the global chapter. We are very supportive of that. And of recent, we as MAFO in the movement here, we applied for the USAID grant. We went on to the final stage of the USAID, but unfortunately, we were unable to get the funding. Then as a member, we get on to them and tell them, let them give us a feedback as to what was our problem or the fault we have along the process. But up to now, we have not yet heard from the USAID ID.
Aha.
Yeah, so we want to know our fault so that we want to improve on that.
Very
Thank
good.
you, Lansana. Thank you so much. And just wanted to say here a couple of things that, as Lansana pointed out, which kind of brings us to the next round of questions also, is that this is a local organization from Sierra Leone that mobilizes fundings from community contributions, right? So they bring together their own resources, and they were really wanting to scale up this work during the pandemic. And so they said, let's try and see if we can get funding. And they actually, what Lansana did not, I know there have been connectivity issues and time issues. What Lansana did not say here was they even went to the extent of finding partners who would bring them internet connection so that they could connect and be part of the processes. And they spent their own resources in being a part of the process so that they could get funding for scaling up. Eventually, that did not happen. It could be for any number of reasons. They don't reason. I think the challenge here is we're talking about local organizations and funding community-led action. Community groups mobilize funds, they want to do this work, then they need to scale up. So they're looking for funding for scaling up. They're using their own resources from contributions to try to access this funding. How can we, in the different roles where we are sitting, in the different parts of the ecosystem, at least create a system which allows them to be there as equals? Because it's much easier for a bigger INGO and others to participate in these processes of getting funding, right? Of co-creating, of all these other processes. It's so much more difficult for a local CBO that has to decide, I have so much of member contribution now. What am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to use this to go for a meeting so that I can try and get some funding to scale up my work. It's a very, very tough choice for them and really doesn't allow them to participate in a lot of these processes. So how can we, from where we are sitting in the funding ecosystem, what is possible to allow and to ensure that local organizations and community-based organizations can access this funding? And I'm going to start here with Jenny, maybe you again, to say, what is possible for organizations like MAFO to really access and get funding to scale up their work?
Oh, that's a simple question, Gunjan. So I think let me sort of start high level and drill down. I think what people are saying here is there is not a systemic view of seeing these things alongside each other. So the system that we have at the moment is not equipped to see community contribution, and certainly not to see community contribution as a proxy for trust. So the 2.whatever trillions that we're talking about for the SDGs, I mean, how much of that money is set aside around distrust, the audit, the compliance, the assumption that people are going to run away with the money? So I think that the systemic approach is actually, how can one enable a system where one can actually see these resources alongside? So a $1 given at a local level is not just $1, it's $1 with connection, trust. There's something going on there that matters. USAID's money may be big, but it's kind of chilly bureaucratic money. And so I think this idea of like breaking down the silos between different kinds of resources and appreciating that they all have a different role to play. And if they can see each other, then they can better connect with each other. I also think from where I sit, so I sit in a part of the ecosystem where we work with local actors who are, as I said, community-based or community proximate grant makers. There are very few organizations in the global south that make grants because it is their developmental purpose. There are plenty that are re-granting intermediaries. But that's not, the power is still held by the funder. And so this ecosystem of local actors who combine grant making, local resource mobilization, and who have to build trust. You can't raise money locally and make a bad decision because that's you done, you know. So it's really that, you know, one is the, how do we change our lens, our metrics, so that we can say, yes, there must be accountability upwards to back donors or to taxpayers in a country like Kenya. You know, if I pay taxes, I want to know how money in the devolution process was spent. So it's not an illegitimate question to ask about that sort of vertical accountability, but actually, how do we get better at seeing the horizontal accountability? So if you're sitting in Washington and you know you've got a group that is able to leverage community resources on an expanding basis year in, year out, you have a pretty good proxy for legitimacy and trust. And I think it's, we all sit in our bits, our boxes, kind of looking over thinking, well, I can't get to that because of that. So that, I think, you know, that systems approach, but acknowledging the importance of these interstitial bridging organizations that can show up in the dominant system, can receive and administer external money and do all the nonsense there, that ideally are not international NGOs, but actually are community rooted and community owned, like they have an element of local community philanthropy and local constituency. Maybe they involve community members in their decision-making process, uses participatory grant making or whatever, and they are able to target resources at the level at which they are required to local organizations, and in the same time, maybe leverage those monies within the community, but also maybe money from others in that country more broadly. And that bit is clearly needed. It's like, who is going to put the resources in to help make that happen? It's the plumbing system that is between the kind of power hose and the green shoots. And I think it is a systemic gap right now, which needs to be recognized, because as I see it, that's the only way to address this kind of big money to community level action thing without destroying organizations.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Arjun, I'm going to come over to you and say, you know, what can bilaterals, because this is not just about USAID, you know, this is, I think, a general issue in terms of on one hand, we are trying to go through and introduce processes like co-creation to bring in, you know, the perspectives and not be very rigid in the grant making. On the other hand, there is a cost involved for local organizations, which almost makes it a barrier for them to participate. You know, what can be done so that they can still access funding, they can still think of scaling up, but without having to be the ones bearing all the cost and the risk of it? Again, simple question.
Yeah, you know, it's a very it's an important question. Jenny was right to describe USAID's funding as sort of a cold, bureaucratic, like distanced funding source, right? Certainly the agency has programs. There's the Unsolicited Solutions for Locally Led Development. DIV does grants that, you know, if you're doing certain types of technological innovation, might be more accessible, maybe, perhaps, right? But in general, there are very few instances and opportunities where the agency is able to navigate its own risk mitigation processes, and specifically fiduciary risk mitigation processes, to be able to get financing to a local level, to communities, to community-based organizations, in ways that are manageable, responsible, and responsive to actually the goals and objectives of those community-based organizations. And so the trick is, you know, what are the funding models that bring resources closer to communities without at the same time bringing the burdens that we impose? And I think it is important to, you cannot underestimate the burdens that we impose on organizations to have USAID funding, but also the burdens that we put on ourselves. So for instance, there is no like internal process for us to provide like reimbursements to organizations that apply for funds and then are required to go to some sort of co-creation thing, right? We also don't have to do a co-creation workshop to do co-creation. Like we can also make it cheaper. for people. But if it's not, like, there's just no, like, there's no way to write a check. There's no, we are like constrained to our grant making processes. And I think it's really interesting because that is the trick for bilaterals. Are you a procurement agency or are you a development agency or a humanitarian assistance agency, right? Like those are distinct objectives, and USAID often defaults to the objectives of a procurement body. And so the other piece of trying to ensure resources get closer to communities and are accessible by community-based organizations is also making sure that you're doing that to advance development objectives, which means that those resources are coming closer, but so is the power, the decision-making over how the use of those resources will be done, right? Like, we actually can get resources really close to communities, but where we struggle is being able to both get the resources there and get some level of decision-making or autonomy or priority setting at the same time, right? How do we get the money close without having the strings? Over.
Thank you so much, Arjun. And I know that wasn't an easy question to answer, but thank you. Zippy, if I can come to you next, how can we scale up some of the community-led work which is happening, and what are you thinking from Kenya, from the government perspective?
Yes, thank you again. One of the key things in ensuring that community finances come closer to the people, and especially through the subnationals, one of the key things is looking at how much goes to overheads in terms of when funding comes, what percentage goes to the communities against what goes to overheads in terms of managing offices, managing officers in the field. The model here in Makueni County is that government commitment, or the subnational commitment, is that there is an office responsible in the management of community-led development or the public participation function here in Kenya. And it has over 50 officers scattered in all the sub-counties and the wards in order to ensure that the communities and the community-based organizations here are continually strengthened in terms of capacity. One advantage of this model is that there's government commitment by ensuring that there is a full-time office responsible, paid by government, so that in the reception of donor funding or proposals that are funded by the county government itself are 100% going to benefit the communities. And so this has worked since 2019. And I think it's something worth thinking through. Many times you have to think about sustaining the offices of the community-based organizations and so forth. But here, thinking from a government perspective, then just looking at what we borrowed from India during our establishment here, what the Panchayat looks like in India and how funding comes from Panchayat, yet they are responsible mentors of the community, animators of the development model, community-led development models to the community, but they are not part of the resources or overheads that come to the communities. That way, there is more money that is structured towards support for the communities and in the kind of programs that the communities are undertaking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zippy. And I know this is a topic that we can really talk a lot about. So what I think we also saw a lot of questions coming in. So what I would like to do, Amy and Jamie, before we come to you, is really to try and take a couple of those questions, and then we're going to come back. So Anna, do you want to just share some of the questions that are coming up for the panelists with us?
Yeah, so Vadim had a very interesting question. What benefits and threats of the digitalization for Shift the Power would you like to point out? This was specifically for Jenny and Arjun, but I think everybody could chime in if they have interesting examples of the benefits and threats of digitalization.
I'm happy to jump in. Greetings, Vadim, who's joining from Ukraine, express solidarity for the current situation there. I know you're asking this, Vadim, because your organization has done amazing work around using technology to kind of activate community mobilization. I think it's a huge area. I mean, the internet is fraught with many challenges, and not least kind of problems confronting civil society and how states use it and whatever, but the ability to kind of use tech to join people up, even kind of low tech, I think, to create that sense of being in some part of something bigger is really interesting. And I mean, from where I sit, I don't have to have the answers to this. We merely work with partners in different parts of the system who are testing these kinds of ideas to create conversations that can be online and offline. I think one thing that we know is, with so much of the work that our partners do around the world, the in-person interaction is critical to building trust. You can amplify it by online stuff too, but actually the in-person stuff is really, really critical. So I mean, obviously there's huge opportunities, but in the context of constraints to do with who controls the internet and technology more broadly. But I do want to highlight some of the amazing work that Vadim's organization has been doing in Ukraine.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Jenny. I think, Vadim, we'd love to get a little write-up on that and share it with everybody. That sounds wonderful. And the threats are clearly real. So we are all Ukrainians today, I think. So let me, Gunjan, call on Arjun. Arjun, do you have a comment on this? And let me just add, as you come in, I'm seeing all kinds of ways the movement, and Anne has commented in the chat, a lot of what people are calling for is stuff we are trying to learn how to do in the movement local chapters. So many of them are now completely community-led and provide that kind of plumbing. So we will hopefully contribute to that. Arjun, do you want to respond to that Buddy's question?
You know, it's a great question. Solidarity, 100%. I think that there's some different angles to answer it from. Let me. One of the things that we did in NPI is worked with our colleagues in the Management Bureau to launch work with USAID.org. Right. It's just a platform. It has some good resources on there. It helps people understand what it takes to manage US government funds, blah, blah, blah. It has a little partner directory. One of the really interesting things there is that we reached out to organizations, many of whom who had very limited web presences, right? Maybe a face page, maybe, and asked them whether this sort of this listing on the website was something that was useful to them, that they could use to market themselves. We asked big primes, like, would you be able to source local organizations from here? And our colleagues in the DRG Center said, hey, are you able to unpublish people's directories? Like, you know that a government just changed and they're about to tax all of these civil society organizations and NGOs, and they don't have a list of civil society organizations or NGOs. They're just going on your website and pulling down the list of organizations who signed up. And so you should do something about that. Yeah, we did have to do something about that. And that's just like one example of something that you think is good and actually is good, is providing, using a digital tool to provide connection between different types of organizations, and is also like immediately, like the next day, putting organizations at risk.
Yes.
And so I think that is true of all the digital tools and all the different ways that we can leverage them. And it's just something where we have to remain thoughtful and be mindful of our do no harm principles, and think about safeguarding and ensure that we are putting thought towards the use of tools to solve problems. Over.
Great, thanks, Sergeant. Thank you. The Anna, can we have one more question?
Yeah, I'd like to call on Roberto to unmute himself. And Robbie, if you want to ask your question out loud, you can, or I can read it, whichever, if you're not available.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. Hope you are doing well. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think that is really important. So I just want to ask you, how do you think it can be ensured that the countries of the Global South, organized communities or local networks or collectives or small local organizations can not only lead the operation of the financing already allocated, but can also get involved and lead together with the financiers when they are designing investment strategic towards to the Global South?
Great
Getting
question.
at the beginning.
Yeah. So Roberto's question, Zippy, you were actually pointing to some of this. You know, how can these networks of organization get to the decision-making table? Do you want to comment on what's happening in McQueeney? If you can.
Yes, thank you, John. One is that through the county governments, there are opportunities for donor roundtables to receive, just to have a look at the community proposals that receive support from the office, especially my office, in terms of writing and any other necessary support required in terms of BQs and what is required to make a successful proposal from the communities. The other is that actually, even at national level, we need to be able to have confessions that cause us to think together around the local methodologies that are emerging, so that we are able to assist each other and to study from the local contexts themselves to be able to grow from within. And I say that Kenya and among other countries that have devolution policy would be fertile grounds for opportunities for this kind of a thing. In McQueeney County, we are establishing the County School of Community-Led Development because the opportunities that are available is much really the community strengthening. If they do not know, no matter how many funds and how much funds will be coming to the communities, there will not be sustainability, there will not be stronger ownership and continuity if the capacities still remain low. It will still just be another form of dependency. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Zippy. So let me, I think, you know, when the UN Commission on Social Development set up this method of having these virtual side events, they defined our time limits, and we're getting relatively close to that time limit. So I want to go, as Gunjan mentioned at the beginning, we'd like to go a quick round and kind of hear a call to action from each of our panelists. Let me start with Amy. Amy, what would you like everyone to do?
Hey, John. What would I like everyone to do? Well, I'd like everyone to do what Zippy just said and make sure that there is no dependency on action and local governments are supplying money to everyone at the community level. But since that is at the moment unrealistic, but something we're all working towards, and it's great that we're all coming together. What I think the most important thing of working towards that is actually partnership and people coming together. And the work that you do with your community-led movement is one form of partnership. One thing we do in the UN is something called the Sdg Action Campaign. We're doing a campaign which is called Flip the Script at the moment. It's all on a website. I would recommend that you go and have a look at that. The idea is that it's an initiative from the Secretary General about collecting all these experience of local action and then being able to feed that into global debates, global conversations where member states are happening, and more people coming together and showing the different experiences that they have. And so all the work that you've mentioned on the chat that I've been reading, I think that would be very interesting to be up there so that other people can actually see the work that you're doing. So that's my call to action. Thank you.
Well, great, and we will get you instructions on how to do that so that we can get those up in front of world leaders everywhere. Thank you, Amy. Arjun, what do you want everybody to do?
You know, USAID is, the administrator gave us a call to action internally in terms of envisioning USAID as an agency for inclusive development, in terms of advancing localization, both in terms of to whom we provide funds, but also in terms of how of power and decision making, and who is able to influence our behavior. And so I would, as a call to action, ask you to influence our behavior and help us figure out how to do this. Our localization agenda is broad. It has all these internal work streams and different pieces that we're doing. And part of that is a commitment from our leadership to ensure that we consult locally for each of those different work streams. And as those turn into like products and something we would want to do together, ideally. And so I hope that you can help shape our behavior over this next year, really, next year and a half. And don't hesitate to call us out, because that is also important for not advancing towards these sort of big objectives of ours, or doing it in a way that is sort of insincere. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Arjun. And yes, we will all try to do that. And in fact, I was really thrilled that the new US government gender policy not only requires every agency to listen to the local women's movement, but to make sure that their voices are actually translate into programs. So not only listen, but obey. So this is a wonderful call to action. Thank you. Jamie, what do you see everyone should be doing?
Well, that's a very good question, and Arjun raises a couple of questions that we have to address, I think, offline, especially since he says USAID has a lot of money for this. But for the larger group, I think Amy already started touching on it, and it relates actually to a large number of the questions. I think it's about a partnership and collaborative governance in a multi-level public sector. Very concretely, what I would encourage you to do, and already Zippy showed the example in Macoiney County, is educate yourself and work together. In the case of Sierra Leone, USAID funding may not be forthcoming, but the World Bank is going to be passing resources through their new program to the district level. There's a new infusion of funding for the local development fund there. So there is a lot of space for community actors to help district government shape the agenda, right? Part of the beauty of decentralized governance and community-led development is that it's highly efficient to mobilize resources. But in order for that to happen, for that value for money that you are giving to the public sector to be there, you need to have a seat at the table. And that seat at the table comes by working together with other community-based actors, but also with local government associations, also sitting together with researchers and policy thinkers. So I would encourage the members of the movement to educate themselves about the intergovernmental environment in which they're operating, work together, form a working group at the country level, not here in Washington. Too many of us here already. We should be moving out instead of more people coming here. But use the resources available to understand and map out the funding flows, to realize where you are able to improve the value for money. Is it in pushing money down? Is it in pushing money to the places in your country that need it the most? Or is it in transforming the resources that are available locally into outcomes that are needed for the community at large? So I would encourage you to collaborate across the spectrum, across levels of government, and quite frankly, the digital tools are both a benefit and a threat there. It's easier than ever to connect, as today's call shows. At the same time, it's a risk. Unfortunately, in many of the countries I work, central governments may not like to make a map of where poverty is highest or where water access is lowest, because that's a threat for the next election. So, I think there's a lot of work to be done, but at the same time, with all these partners at the table, I think there is a lot of opportunity to start swaying the resources to where they're needed the most and used in an inclusive manner. Thank you, John.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Zippy, over to you. What's your call to action?
Yes, thank you. I'm just reminded about Mahatma Gandhi's statement that until every village becomes a republic, having its own sources of water, growing his own crops and livestock, developing their own clothes and their own roads, their own hospitals, we will not have yet achieved. And therefore, I keep to call on us to action in terms of community capacity strengthening, ensuring that the role of SDG 17, which becomes the basis for all other SDGs, is really operational. And just saying, like my colleague that has just spoken, let's move out of Washington, come here and help us, like the Macedonian call, come and help us and see what we are doing and be able to help us so that we are able to upscale this progress throughout the country as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Zippy. And you, Jenny, what say you?
So I think we need a new framework in which those of us who are up for change see a role for ourselves. I mean, the good society, what is development about? It's not about moving money from A to B. It is about everyone, wherever they are, being in places where they are treated with dignity and equity, and they can do what they want to do in the ways that they want to do it. And it's as simple as that. We often just get preoccupied so that there's the development actors getting money to communities. That's not maybe the framing that's most helpful. So we need new ways of deciding and doing to this. We need a new vision, a new whither are we trying to get to? And I think we need to change our mindsets throughout, where we need to challenge ourselves. So for civil society organizations to think about, are we owned by community? Are we legitimate? If we were closed down tomorrow, would our communities care? If not, what are we going to do about it? Or are we just set up to deliver money? So to challenge ourselves to think differently and look to the community as a source of resource, not just as a source of needs. And I think for funders, similarly, to see, are there things I can't see? And if I just put new lenses in my glasses, I could actually see that my work was helping to build something that we could leave behind and that would be co-owned by everyone. I think we're just all very blind in this. And I'd say throughout this issue of power, power is not just a north-south phenomenon. It's not just a center-periphery phenomenon. Power dynamics exist everywhere. And that's why I would really emphasize, we can't use the same ways of doing development, the log frames, the projects, assuming everything exists in silos. This is not the world we are in. And so we do need different practices, different governance structure, different models, different appreciation of resources in that reconfiguration. Otherwise, all we'll end up doing is just moving the locus of power from Washington to Nairobi or to Makweni or whatever. Nothing personal, Zippy, it was just the name that came to mind there. But actually, we really need to look at the how of what we're doing and who we're including. We have inherited structures and systems, but maybe it's time, wherever we are in the world, this is not just a global South thing, this is everywhere. I think COVID and Black Lives Matter have really challenged everyone to rethink, are our structures really fit for purpose? So I really think there's an opportunity to both be very visionary, but also practical in terms of where can we work at the intersections? For those who are up for it, where do we find these new pathways where resources can flow and land on fertile territory?
Wonderful, Jenny, thank you. Gunjan, do you want to close us out, please?
Yes, and I know we are at time, so just to say thank you very much to all our panelists and to all the participants who have been with us today. The chat has been extremely rich. There have been some fabulous examples, comments, ideas, and questions in the chat. But as Jenny said, that, I think this is a complex area. And this is not something that's going to happen overnight, but it is something that requires introspection at every level. And for each of us to challenge ourselves, we will continue to do this. And we hope that you will be with us in this journey and continue to challenge us and also work with us as we try and see what is the role that we can play in the system to ensure that communities get the funding, get the finance, and are strengthened to do what they want to do in a way that is meaningful and dignified for them. We did have a last slide, which was more of an announcements thing. John, if we can just get that up, that's just FYI for everybody who was in here. But really just wanted to say a big thank you to everybody who's been here for bringing your experiences, your ideas, and for having such a frank conversation around some of the challenges that we face and continue to face. Just a quick couple of announcements. John mentioned we have done an open letter to Mark Sussman, which has been signed by a number of MCLD members and organizations from around the world, again, on this whole idea of funding, and funding paradigms and how they work and what it means for communities. So please do look it up. And then we have 2 upcoming events. We have a special workshop on community-led monitoring with the ITPC happening next Wednesday. And then we have a CSW side event happening in March, which is really about celebrating young female activists from the Global South and the work that they've been doing. We all know about Greta Thunberg, but there are so many of them in the Global South that we don't hear about, who are really changing the way their communities are thinking about climate. So that's going to be our opportunity to celebrate them and to hear from them directly. Thank you, everyone.
So if everyone wants to unmute and say goodbye, we can all say goodbye to each other. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye, Dr. John. Bye, Madam Ann. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Gunjan. Bye.
Bye,
Yeah,
Jude.
bye, everybody.
Bye.